Hi, again. Before we get started, since we just had lunch break again, because yesterday I presented right after lunch, presenting after lunch again, just again, notice if there's anything that you need right now. And again, if you need to do anything during the presentation to be able to focus, like if you need to move around, do what you need to do. And again, like I said yesterday, just to notice if there's anything that you can do to tend to your nervous system during the presentation. So, so our presentation is titled Giftedness as Neurodivergence, Not Functioning Label. And I met you all yesterday, or most of you. I'm Katy Higgins Lee. I'm a neurodivergent therapist, specifically AuDHD and 2E. I'm also a clinical supervisor and an unschooling parent. I live in California, about an hour north of San Francisco.
And I'm Marni Kammersell. I'm also a neurodivergent, autistic, and ADHD educator, a doctoral student in education, and an unschooling parent of 3 2E kids. And I'm trying not to get too close because then it hurts, but yes, nice to meet you all, and I am local as well. So here are some of the main ideas that we'll be exploring today. First, it's important to understand that giftedness in itself is a form of neurodivergence. Additionally, giftedness frequently accompanies other forms of neurodivergence, creating unique profiles. And finally, accurate identification is crucial for self-understanding and for individuals to access the right support and resources.
So we're going to begin with a discussion of neurodivergence. So I defined a lot of this yesterday, but we're going to do it again just in case, because again, somebody might just watch this one presentation or you might just be joining us. So the term neurodivergent refers to anyone whose neurocognition diverges from dominant societal expectations and norms. And this includes both experiences and behaviors. And you might notice that the definition is slightly different than what I used yesterday. And I kind of did that on purpose with yesterday, having it be different, because I wanted to show that there's not one exact definition, but they all have, they're the same, but slightly different wording. So some examples of that are autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyscalculia, giftedness, OCD, post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic brain injury, long-term meditation practice, heavy psychedelic drug use, and really almost everything in the DSM, and also many experiences that have not been included in the DSM, such as high sensitivity, aphantasia, etc. And if you're not familiar, like I mentioned yesterday, the DSM is the manual for diagnosing supposed mental disorders and supposed neurodevelopmental disorders. I use the word supposed when referring to them as disorders because the idea that they're disorders is questionable, as has been talked about this week. Within the neurodiversity paradigm, there's a questioning of the idea that there is one normal or healthy type of brain or neurocognitive functioning. Instead of viewing all the types of neurodivergence as being disorders that we catch like a sickness, we can see them as natural variations and aspects of our identity. And this is why many of us prefer to be referred to as autistic instead of person with autism, and an ADHDer instead of a person with ADHD. So the neurodiversity paradigm rejects the idea of neuronormativity. I'm going to adjust something, hang on here. Okay, so I'm just going to say that again because I don't remember where I was in the sentence. The neurodiversity paradigm rejects the idea of neuronormativity, which is the idea that there are certain cognitions and behaviors that are considered normal, and that anyone who deviates is considered abnormal. A person whose cognitions and behaviors align with the dominant societally accepted neurocognitive experiences and behaviors would be considered neuronormative. And we're really just scratching the surface of this topic, so we will have some resources at the end to learn more about this. So the neurodiversity paradigm, oh, that didn't work. Thank you. Okay. So the title of our presentation is Giftedness as Neurodivergence, Not Functioning Label. So what is a functioning label? A functioning label is a label that's used to describe a person's ability to function in society, which usually equates to how they contribute to capitalism. The use of functioning labels is outdated for many reasons, including that they are oversimplifications. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, okay, so I didn't list the examples that are there, like high-functioning autism versus low-functioning autism. So the use of functioning labels is outdated for many reasons, including that they're oversimplifications, ableist, and invalidating of people's experiences. Some people perceive the term gifted to be a functioning label, and it's often used that way, which is based in a misunderstanding of giftedness, though. So functioning labels are problematic because they're often used to deny individuals the supports that they need or to undermine their agency. Instead, gifted should help us understand and address specific needs. Gifted children have unique needs because of their giftedness, and they deserve to understand why they experience the world differently. They need environments designed to meet their specific needs. Okay. Thank you. We're having a problem where it's like sometimes one of the controllers doesn't work and sometimes the other one doesn't work. So that's why there's a pause there. We're trying to figure out which one will work. So unfortunately, some people also still equate giftedness with academic achievement, which is a one-dimensional perspective. When we view something in one dimension, we're usually seeing a warped version of it. Not all gifted people experience academic achievement. So when we view giftedness this way, we neglect many people. Most people in the giftedness community have already expanded their view to see more than one dimension, to see that it doesn't always include academic achievement, but that it does include asynchronous development and that it includes OEs. But this view is still not quite complete because in reality, not all gifted people experience OEs. So a multidimensional perspective accounts for hopefully all experiences of giftedness. We can see that giftedness includes asynchronous development, that it often includes experiencing OEs, but not always, and that it is a type of neurodivergence that also commonly co-occurs with other kinds of neurodivergence. When we view giftedness as neurodivergence, we're able to expand our view to encompass the full complexity and multidimensionality of ourselves. OEs are one way to think about neurodivergent needs, if you prefer not to use DSM terms, but we found that OEs are useful when understood in conjunction with the terms of the neurodiversity movement, like what I talked about yesterday. There is a synergy between these paradigms. The terms autism and ADHD are DSM terms, but within the neurodiversity paradigm, we can reclaim these terms and use them in ways that are empowering and supportive instead of pathologizing. And perhaps most importantly, when we have a multidimensional perspective of giftedness within the neurodiversity paradigm, we can focus on giftedness as being defined by our needs instead of our behaviors.
So what do we mean when we say giftedness is a neurodivergence? Neurodivergence simply means deviating from social expectations for experiences and behaviors. From this perspective, giftedness is clearly a form of neurodivergence. Those of us who are parenting gifted children or who were gifted children ourselves know that gifted kids develop on a different timeline. Asynchronous development is a key characteristic used to identify giftedness. Gifted individuals often show advanced cognitive abilities and heightened intensities in various areas, but this doesn't always translate to high academic achievement. Not all high achievers are gifted, and many gifted kids resist traditional schooling or only engage selectively. Katie and I are both unschooling parents, meaning we support our kids in self-directed learning. We believe all children deserve much more autonomy in their education than they typically receive. However, when discussing gifted children in traditional schools, it's important to acknowledge that they experience an even greater disconnect between their needs and their educational experiences compared to many of their peers. This is another way that understanding giftedness as a neurodivergence is so important. Recent brain imaging studies show that gifted individuals have more white matter and synaptic connections in their brains. Autistics and ADHDers have also been shown to have different patterns of synaptic connectivity than people who are considered neurotypical. One theory is that the immune system plays a key role in trimming these connections. Differences in the immune systems of neurodivergent individuals might affect this process, contributing to our unique cognitive profiles. In recent decades, scientific research has increasingly connected our immune systems to a wide range of functions, from influencing our moods to impacting significant health outcomes like cancer. This brings us to the concept of hyperbrain, hyperbody. Research shows that gifted individuals are often multiply neurodivergent and are also more likely to have physical differences such as allergies, asthma, connective tissue disorders, and autoimmune diseases. This connection between brain and body underscores the holistic nature of neurodivergence. By understanding these links, gifted individuals and their families can gain deeper insights into their unique profiles, helping them navigate both their mental and physical health. So I know that most of you at the Dabrowski Congress are familiar with twice exceptionality, but as Katy said in her presentation yesterday, we're reiterating this here for anyone who might watch on YouTube or anyone who is newer to the field of giftedness and twice exceptionality. So 2E individuals are those who are both gifted and disabled. This dual identification means that we possess high abilities in certain areas while also experiencing challenges or differences that impact our learning or daily living. Although we don't have time in this presentation to explore this in detail, we do want to mention the social model of disability. This model suggests that disability arises not just from an individual's personal characteristics, but rather from the interaction between the individual and their environment. In other words, the environment plays a significant role in either disabling or enabling a person. Some people prefer the term spiky profile when talking about 2E experiences. It's common for 2E individuals to find that some tasks which might be difficult for others come easily to them, while tasks that are typically easy for others can be really challenging. For instance, a twice exceptional individual might excel in solving complex math problems, but struggle with memorizing the multiplication tables. This variability underscores the importance of understanding and supporting both strengths and challenges.
So, as Marni mentioned, 2 of the common exceptionalities that co-occur with giftedness are autism and ADHD, and that's what we are focusing on today, because that's our lived experience. And autism, ADHD, and giftedness are separate neurotypes that share some traits and are also commonly co-occurring. I created this diagram about 3 years ago, and I have revised it several times, and I plan to revise it probably again very soon, because it's very far from perfect and always have been. I initially did not plan to actually share it with anybody when I created it. It was just for my own understanding. So I created this partially out of frustration with the misalignment between what I was learning in the giftedness community and then what I was learning in the neurodiversity community. I also wanted to compare autism, ADHD, and giftedness using neutral language. Most of the resources in the giftedness community describe giftedness with affirming language, but then describe autism and ADHD with deficit-based language. You can't accurately understand how two or three things compare to each other when there are discrepancies like this in your languaging. And of course, many of us experience 2 or even 3 of these types of neurodivergence, as Marni and I do. So I'm not going to go through this in detail. It's available online in various places if you want to see it, and I do plan to update it, like I said, soon.
So AuDHD is a term many people use to describe those of us who are both autistic and ADHDers. Both of us are gifted, autistic, and ADHDers, which we refer to as 2E AuDHD. And I want to note that while this is our lived experiences, we are both white-presenting women who grew up in middle-class America. We're also cisgender, heterosexual, married with partners, and our experiences may not represent those of other AuDHD or neurodivergent individuals. So talking about neurodivergence is complex, and please take the time to listen to a wide range of neurodivergent voices, including those who hold multiple marginalized identities, such as people of color, non-speakers, AAC users, members of the LGBTQIA+ community, and those who are multiply disabled. So as autistic ADHDers, we experience sensory processing differences and attentional traits like hyperfocus and a preference for deep engagement. We can be highly social in the right company while also craving quiet alone time. Many of us describe a push-pull experience, for example, needing novelty while also wanting routine and predictability. This can make for some funny TikToks, and sometimes people like to talk about their autism wanting one thing while their ADHD wants something different. I don't personally like to use that kind of framing because to me, these categories are all socially constructed rather than neurobiologically determined. And at the same time, I don't mean to say socially constructed in the sense that they're not real. They're very real experiences, and yet the way that we understand them is a cultural construct. So nevertheless, the experience of wanting and needing different things at the same time is very relatable. It can be confusing for both us and outside observers when different aspects of our personalities surface at different times. For example, how can someone who organizes big events that require a lot of interaction later need hours or even days or weeks of quiet time in a dark room? Now, I imagine many of you are feeling that right now on day 3 of the Dabrowski Congress. You've been here, you're in person, and yet, maybe you're gonna need some time after this to have some quiet. So the power of having neurodivergent community is that we get to reframe and normalize these experiences. Many of us who are late identifying never saw ourselves in the medical model descriptions of neurodivergence, even as we studied psychology and the mental health literature. Those deficit-based descriptions, which focus on meeting certain expectations for productivity, get so much wrong. Fortunately, we have other, more helpful and accurate models based on lived experience.
A while back, the gifted community began to equate giftedness with possessing OEs. As most of you know, OE is an abbreviation of overexcitabilities, which are sorry. Yeah, I think I'm just going to put them all on. I just have to say this, that I think that at some point I updated our Google slide and it didn't update, because I'm seeing this and I'm like, no, I changed this. And I had set it up so where it had little things where it would say next for my next slide, and none of that's there. So that's part of what's happening here. Okay, anyway, so OEs, like I said yesterday, are heightened sensitivity and intensity in 5 areas: emotional, intellectual, imaginational, psychomotor, and sensual. Dabrowski proposed that people who possess OEs are more likely to experience positive disintegration processes throughout their lifetime. There's a history of using OEs to identify giftedness and to differentiate giftedness from other types of neurodivergence. Many of us, I mentioned this yesterday, that many of us are familiar with the book by James Webb titled Misdiagnosis and Dual Diagnosis of Gifted Children and Adults. And many of us turn to this book to attempt to clarify whether our children or ourselves are just gifted or are also neurodivergent in other ways. However, this book unfortunately misled many of us because it's based on the DSM criteria for autism and ADHD. And the criteria is not wrong, but it is misleading because of the way it's worded, because it's deficit-based and it's based on observed behaviors instead of subjective experiences. I studied the DSM when I was getting my master's in counseling psychology, and I used the DSM in my clinical practice for more than 10 years and never recognized my own experiences in the descriptions of autism and ADHD. It wasn't until I read non-pathologizing descriptions of autism and ADHD that were based on people's personal subjective experiences that I actually recognized my own experience. And also, that book that I mentioned, it's also based on the idea of equating OEs with giftedness. But recent translations, like I mentioned yesterday, recent translations show that Dabrowski was actually describing various kinds of neurodivergence when he talked about OEs. He was not just describing giftedness. So he was also describing autism, ADHD, and others. So I showed this table yesterday, but I'm including it again, just very briefly. This is the table from the 2021 paper written by Chris Wells and Frank Falk, titled The Origins and Conceptual Evolution of Overexcitability. Shows some examples of ADHD traits in the DSM as compared to psychomotor OE, as described by Dabrowski. And again, there's many similarities there. And then this is the second table that I showed yesterday, with some that I created, but with some feedback from Marni and Chris, to show some examples of traits and experiences that are common with autism and ADHD that might be examples of overexcitabilities. And really, they could be perceived as different ways to talk about the same experience instead of being something that is different from each other. And again, I went over this in more detail in my presentation yesterday, so I'm not going to go through it now, but take a moment to look at it. And if you want to know more, if you didn't, you can watch the recording of my presentation yesterday. Oh, let me give you a minute to look at it. Now we're going to transition into part 2, which is going to be about our experiences as late identified AuDHDers. So my childhood academic experiences included many mixed messages. Although I was ahead of my peers academically in early elementary school and was bored because we were doing things that I already knew, despite that, my first grade teacher recommended that I get held back because she said I was emotionally immature. My parents and I disagreed with her, and so I wasn't held back. My parents actually listened to my feedback when I said, no, I'll be too bored, and so they let me continue on. And then the following year, I was identified as gifted. Very different messages. So this label of gifted supposedly explained my differences from my peers. I was able to start a pull-out gait program in 3rd grade, which was lots of fun, but I had some behavioral issues in the pull-out gait program too. It wasn't enough for my parents to be informed about it or to have any kind of like interventions, but it was clear to me that the teacher wished I would be as quiet and focused as my classmates. I had an ongoing experience of feeling like I was both too much and then not enough. Too quiet and too loud. Too smart and not smart enough. Too excited and not excited enough. I also had sensory sensitivities, but didn't have words to describe these experiences. Then I was invited to transfer into a new program in our district, which would be a full-time gait program. And it was new in our district that year. I was in this program from 4th to 6th grade, and I thrived in that program socially and academically. It was mostly experiential learning with no textbooks and was mostly project-based. However, I remember still being confused by the messages about why that particular group of 28 students was chosen for this class. We were told that we were there because we were smart, but many of us saw how many of us struggled in certain areas. I was advanced in reading, writing, art, and music, but needed a tutor for math because I couldn't learn my times tables. I witnessed the asynchronous development and spiky profiles of me and my classmates, but didn't know terms for that. I didn't understand it, and no adult talked about this with us. I didn't understand why I was so anxious in some situations and so confident in other situations, and a lot of that had to do with sensory sensitivities, but I didn't know that. The gifted label clarified some aspects of my experience, but I was still very in the dark about other aspects. Fast forward many years to when I was 34 and became a parent. We don't have time for me to describe everything that happened in the time in between. It included college, graduate school, many jobs before deciding to become a therapist, various romantic relationships, eventually marriage. There were some struggles, but for me, the biggest struggles came with the birth of my first child, which was now a little over 10 years ago. I was simultaneously overwhelmed and bored, and I didn't understand why other parents seemed to be able to handle things so much better than me. I also didn't understand why other children that we knew were so different from our child. This led to me diving into research, which caused me to revisit the idea of giftedness. Over the following 5 or 6 years, my understanding of myself grew enormously. I discovered that giftedness was not just academic achievement, as I learned about overexcitabilities and asynchronous development. This shed light on some more of my differences, but I was still somewhat confused because it didn't explain all the ways that I felt different. Then, when I was 40, like I mentioned yesterday, someone asked me if I'd considered the possibility that I might be autistic. I resisted this initially. I detailed some of that yesterday, so I won't go into it now, but I'll just say that this initiated a positive disintegration process. I also discovered that I had hypermobility spectrum disorder, which I learned was commonly co-occurring with autism and other types of neurodivergence. This shed light on a lot more of my experience, but I was unsure if autism fit for me. There was still a question mark on autism. Then at 41, I confirmed through an assessment that I'm definitely autistic and that I'm also an ADHDer. Things were getting more clear. Then I learned about additional kinds of neurodivergence that co-occur with autism and ADHD, and these explain so much more of my experience. I was diagnosed with a form of dysautonomia, which is nervous system dysfunction. I learned about dysgraphia and aphantasia. Things got more and more clear for me. And all of this awareness allowed me to really experience this positive disintegration. I had experienced numerous disintegrations throughout my life prior to this one, but this was totally different from the previous disintegrations that I'd been through. This is a quote from Michael Pachowski from his book, Mellow Out. Quote, "Everything has to be admitted into view. Only then can the work of inner transformation begin." End quote. I needed to know that I was neurodivergent to be able to see myself clearly so that I could experience the full complexity that's possible within a disintegrative process, at least at this point. There's probably going to be more down the line.
So looking at the 2E timelines, you can see that we didn't include everything on this timeline. It would have been a lot to fit in. One thing that Katie and I were talking about this morning was that high sensitivity was another one that we both started with HSP and exploring that world. And, that was definitely, I came across an email I had written to someone like, I just learned about HSPs and I'm sure this fits, and now with this fuller view of neurodivergence, that was such a small piece of the picture, but that was the gateway. Along with giftedness, I would say. I think of giftedness as also being a gateway for myself and many other people. So when Katie and I first met and were talking about our childhoods and our stories, we were surprised by how many similarities we found in our 2E timelines. And it turns out that a pattern similar to this is actually pretty common among certain late identified neurodivergent adults, often mothers, who are exploring their children's neurodivergence. That is a big reason why many of us are getting identified in our 30s and 40s as we unravel our complex children. However, it's also complicated because of the long history of pathologization that we've described in this presentation. It took a lot of hyper-focused research and unpacking of stereotypes and misinformation in order to recognize myself as autistic and ADHD, and even more time to be ready to stand up here in front of you and say that openly with no worries or few worries about how people will judge that. So it also took the emergence of the neurodiversity movement and the many lived experiences that others have shared. Rather than exploring neurodivergence through the lens of what's wrong with you, we are now able to consider neurodivergence through the lens of maybe you're one of us. In the gifted world, we often talk about peeling the onion, especially when it comes to understanding complex kids. It's common for 2E kids and neurodivergent kids broadly to receive multiple diagnoses over several years from various specialists. Diagnosis and identification are more of an art than a science, and they're not set in stone. Ultimately, it's all about the internal experience, not just observable behavior. The deficit-based DSM diagnoses were defined by a small group of individuals with a narrow neuronormative worldview based on observations of a limited number of children. We're now integrating the lived experiences of neurodivergent adults into the identification process. Until 2013, you couldn't receive both an autism and an ADHD diagnosis, as Katie mentioned yesterday, but we now know that that overlap is common. Current research suggests that 50 to 70% of autistic individuals also meet the criteria for ADHD, and approximately 30 to 65% of children with ADHD have significant autistic traits, although research is significantly lagging behind how people are discussing these things. And the way that we are discussing these terms is changing all the time. And so it's hard to even talk about academic research because it's still based on the DSM. For those of us uncovering our neurodivergence as adults, it often remains an ongoing process of discovery spanning several years. And Katie mentioned the theory of positive disintegration, which was also very much a part of my experience in understanding myself as neurodivergent. Understanding myself as neurodivergent has changed everything, and particularly it opens up the possibilities for living a life that allows you to thrive. You've probably seen one of these iceberg images before. The traits above the waterline represent those that are more outwardly observable, while the traits below the waterline are underlying experiences that others may not be aware of. Moreover, we may not even be aware of them ourselves. We can be driven by things like sensory sensitivities, but have no words for them or ways to make sense of those experiences, especially as children. When considering this iceberg analogy, it's also helpful to note that the waterline, or what is experienced above the surface, can change depending on factors like age, current mental and physical resources, and environment. Different people will notice different things about each of us. Our tools and coping mechanisms evolve over time as we grow, learn new skills, and face periods of relative ease or more intense demands. This is part of why so many of us are being identified in our 30s and 40s, as I mentioned. The combined demands of adulthood, parenthood, work, and caregiving are significantly greater than in earlier stages of our lives. Perhaps additionally, as we get older, we're just more ready to buck conventional norms, whereas at younger ages, we're wanting to fit in. As a young child, I needed soft clothes and struggled in large gatherings. As I grew and learned social expectations, I was more or less able to comply, to wear certain clothes and to spend time in classrooms, but it came at a price: increased anxiety, dysregulation, and a disconnect from myself and my needs. To be honest, I still like soft clothes and prefer to avoid big gatherings, but I now have so much more understanding of myself that I can choose when I go into those places and how long I stay, what kind of tools I'm going to take with me. I always have loop earbuds in my purse. I always know my eggs are out too, and I always make sure I have a car available or some sort of way of getting away when I need to. So how we express and experience our traits depends greatly on how well our environments align or don't align with our needs. I love this quote from Alfie Kohn, who says, "An essential challenge for parents and teachers, and it is a challenge, to celebrate kids who have the gumption to question what they're told, and indeed to help them become reflective rebels. Instead, too many adults prefer the child of least resistance." Neurodivergent kids are more likely to question what they're told because the typical standards for children often fail to meet their needs. To be clear, I believe these norms are problematic for all kids. Expectations like sitting quietly for hours or obediently following adult directions were developed in order to prepare children for factories, not because they are best practices for children development. For neurodivergent kids, including gifted ones, conforming to these social norms adds another layer of complexity. These demands are so misaligned with their body minds that in order to comply, they often lose essential parts of themselves. As a child, I leveraged my giftedness to gain autonomy. I discovered that if I could play the school game better than anyone else, I could escape many adult demands by outpacing them. So I would finish an entire year's worth of math assignments in the first month or two, and then negotiate to spend the rest of the year doing independent study in the library. Books were my greatest joy and my method of escape. I formed my identity around being gifted. Like many gifted kids, I saw no room for error and considered not knowing the right answer to be a personal failing. My confidence and my sense of self were built on being smart. The value system I developed as a young child was based on a linear hierarchy of intelligence, which I now see as extremely damaging. It took many years to break down what I had learned growing up in a system that views intelligence as one-dimensional, something that you either have or you don't. I experience all 5 overexcitabilities, and as an adult, I've been able to integrate all of these different parts of myself, especially since developing a neurodivergent identity. But despite having all 5 OEs, as a child, I really only thought of myself in this one dimension, my intellect. Researcher and educator Dr. Ben Shahar defines happiness as whole person well-being. My experience in childhood didn't help me think through all of my needs as a whole person. I don't say this as a criticism of my parents, who loved me for exactly who I am, but as a society, we teach children in schools that their personal worth centers around academic achievement and a narrow idea of success. This is terrible for those who aren't naturally successful in school, but it's also not great for those of us who were the so-called winners. Dr. Shahar developed the Spire model of well-being, which includes thinking about well-being across 5 dimensions: spiritual, physical, intellectual, relational, and emotional. When I look at these 5 dimensions, I think many gifted and 2E kids, myself included, focus heavily on the intellectual piece. And I think this is in part related to our hyper-connected, hyper-focused brains who get really interested in the things that we're interested in. But it's also because of the academic achievement and the way that we emphasize that in schools and by parents. As adults guiding young people, we need to make sure that we're guiding them to explore these other aspects of themselves and not just SEL curriculums aimed at improving behavior. Here are a few different examples of concepts that are often talked about in neurodivergent spaces, but are not more widely known. For example, both Katie and I experience degrees of aphantasia, which means we do not think in images, we think in thoughts. I didn't realize how different this was from other people's reality until I joined neurodivergent spaces and found out that aphantasia is actually quite rare, at about 3% of the population, although it is more common among autistic and possibly ADHDers, they're not actually sure. This might seem like a small detail, but having the language to describe your way of thinking or being can be very powerful, especially when you discover it's different from most people around you. In the case of aphantasia, we might be told in a yoga class to visualize a calm place, not realizing that others can actually see that place when they close their eyes. Another example is that children in a local school near me were encouraged to improve their executive functioning and organization skills by picturing a clean locker or bedroom. Without knowledge of aphantasia, educators did not recognize that this task is impossible for some students, likely many of the same kids who struggle with organization, and it would only lead them to frustration and failure. These are just a few examples where neurodivergent insights can greatly improve self-understanding, self-acceptance, and advocacy for individual needs. Now let's move on to part 3, creating neuro-affirming cultures. We'll explore how to build environments that support and celebrate neurodivergent people. This is a quote from Becca Laurie Hector and her recent book, Always Bring Your Sunglasses and Other Stories from a Life of Sensory and Social Invalidation, which was making me laugh this morning because Katie and I were sitting in the back with our sunglasses because the lights in here are a little bright. So Becca says, during my pre-identification years as a child growing up in New York City, I didn't stand a chance at successful regulation. There was just too much that was out of my control, and I was missing all the clues to happiness that knowing I was autistic would have given me. Instead of being taught to tweak my life according to my needs and make my environment work with me, my childhood experiences taught me to tweak myself instead, that I was the one who was broken, didn't fit, and needed to be someone else to be valued. In her book, Becca talks about how life-changing it was when she realized she was extremely sensitive to light, to the point of getting multiple migraines each week and taking heavy medications. Eventually, with much trial and error, she discovered that simply carrying and wearing sunglasses, both indoors and out, made a huge difference for her. These are the kinds of small, simple changes that can take years of trial and error to implement, but we can help others, especially children, make these changes much sooner. Sometimes all it takes is seeing someone confidently wearing their sunglasses to inspire others to do the same. It is even more effective if we proactively offer these kinds of accommodations for everyone, not just identified neurodivergent people, extending to things like fidgets in classrooms and workplaces, regular body breaks, and flexible deadlines. We can also question core assumptions about how people learn, work, and live, as many so-called requirements can be adjusted to better meet individual needs. For example, we've discovered that many more jobs than previously imagined can be done effectively at home.
Before I say this slide, I just have to say that it's really funny to me that that last slide was in here because I completely forgot that was there about the sunglasses. And then I yesterday didn't wear sunglasses and I got a migraine yesterday afternoon and then figured out, oh, maybe I'll put my sunglasses on. Oh, maybe I'll put my hat on. And then that's what I ended up doing today to try to prevent the migraine from happening. So it's funny that it's in there. It's in the slides, yet I still forgot about it and didn't do it. Still
and
learning.
actually, Katie had her sunglasses on. I was like, oh, that's a good idea.
Right. So let's discuss the impact of identification on mental health and well-being. The goal of identification, I'm just going to put the whole slide on rather than trying to do that. Okay. So the goal of identification in both children and adults is to improve the quality of life for the individual, not to make normative society more comfortable. I mention this because there's so much focus on accurate identification in order to have things like early intervention services for children. But this is usually for the purpose of implementing behavioral therapies with goals of making autistic and ADHD children appear more, quote, normal through masking neurodivergent traits. However, masking and compensation for neurodivergent traits is associated with lower self-esteem, identity confusion, and even post-traumatic stress. As a reminder of what I shared yesterday about the comedian Hannah Gadsby, when she got diagnosed as autistic in her 30s, she said it felt like an exfoliation of shame. When proper identification is then coupled with appropriate support, accommodations, resources, and community, identification can lead to improved mental health and to avoid misdiagnosis of other mental health conditions. It's so common for autism and ADHD to be misdiagnosed as something else, such as autistic burnout getting misdiagnosed as depression, sensory sensitivities getting misdiagnosed as anxiety, and ADHD getting misdiagnosed as bipolar disorder. This is a serious problem because it leads to inaccurate treatment, which can have catastrophic effects on the individual. I have 2 different clients who have family members who died that in our therapy, we were able to talk about it and figure out they were probably autistic. One of them in burnout, the other a PDA, or if you don't know about PDA, I don't think we go into that today, but that's a whole thing, that it can be literally life-saving to have these correct diagnoses, correct identifications. Another reason for accurate identification is so that individuals can choose academic and occupational goals that are appropriate for who they actually are, instead of who normative society says they should be. Because neurodivergent people are more likely to experience OEs, we're also more likely to go through these disintegrative processes. And like I talked about yesterday, identification can lead to more appropriate support and accommodations during a disintegrative process, which can increase the likelihood that the disintegration can be a positive disintegration.
So here are some specific ways to support neurodivergent, gifted, and 2E youth. First, it's essential to help them identify and address their specific needs. These will vary widely, but might include things like high sensitivity, understanding interest-based attention patterns, or managing sensory and executive function challenges. It's also important to educate young people about their nervous systems and patterns of regulation and dysregulation. Next, we can suggest tools and strategies tailored to their needs. I'm going to go through this a little fast, so we have time for questions. And we can also help them improve awareness of neurodivergent experiences and encourage parents and educators to explore their own potential neurodivergence, shift expectations, and reject neuronormativity. Finally, foster connections with other neurodivergent individuals and families to share experiences and increase support.
So here are some suggestions of ways to create neuro-affirming environments. These ideas can be used within family, education, clinically, and even in a job setting. It's first important to practice radical acceptance of self and other in our understanding of needs. Sometimes accommodating needs will be inconvenient, but it is necessary. Next, it's important to reject neuronormative ideas and expectations. Again, this is for both self and other. This includes avoiding assumptions and demands based on normative expectations. We also need to listen to neurodivergent voices so that we understand the lived experience underneath behaviors. And lastly, like I mentioned yesterday, the term neuroqueer is to intentionally subvert all kinds of normativity, which moves beyond just acceptance of those that are out of the box to intentionally being out of the box. We can practice neuroqueering within ourselves, but also in our roles as parents, teachers, therapists, supervisors, etc. And I said all types of normativity because people who are neurodivergent, including gifted, autistic, and ADHDers, are more likely to be gender diverse. Acceptance of neurodivergence includes acceptance of gender diversity.
So as we wrap up our presentation today, thank you for taking the time to listen. If you have just one takeaway from what we have shared, I hope it's that understanding ourselves as multiply neurodivergent rather than just gifted has been empowering for both of us. It is possible to be healthy, happy, and well supported as an autistic person or an ADHDer, and you don't necessarily have to have considered the medical model or DSM as something that fit within your life in order to be neurodivergent. Many neurodivergent people never explore a neurodivergent identity because it is hard to see beyond the constraints of neuronormativity. Additionally, for individuals who already hold marginalized identities based on race or socioeconomic status, it may not be safe to explore or openly identify as neurodivergent. Yet we can claim neurodivergence and find meaning in the neurodiversity paradigm while rejecting the pathology paradigm. For most of us, unlocking this self-understanding requires an intense period of disintegration. In embracing neurodivergence, we can find greater self-understanding and also the key to living more authentic and fulfilling lives. Thank you again for joining us on this journey.
Thank you so much, Marni and Katy. First question that's popped into Slido from John. Can we go back to the slide with recommendations for children? I missed the last bullet, but understand slides will be shared. So that's question one. And then from Anonymous, not a question, but I'd like to share that I love this presentation and I felt truly seen with the comment that motherhood equals simultaneously overwhelmed and bored. So, any questions from the room?
Twinkle hands on that one.
They have it up there on the podium.
What?
Oh, here, Mary.
Thank you for your presentation. Marni, I had a question on your diagram about yourself. You mentioned auditory process as a fellow person who has central auditory processing. What did you do for your auditory processing? Do you have a filter?
I have a filter in at the
okay.
moment.
Okay.
And I know that Linda sends many people up to Able
Able
Kids
Kids,
here
okay.
in Colorado, so.
That kind of answers, and you use headphones and to see quiet when you're overstimulated?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. But also just, I think for me, the biggest thing is just really being aware of it makes a huge difference and feeling empowered that, I walked in this morning and there was a presentation playing and people talking, and I was able to say to Nicole, let's go talk in the library. There's just a lot going on in this room, and that just being normalized. Yeah. Thanks.
Hi, you two. Thank you so much. That was beautiful, and I have been waiting to hear that presentation for a very long time. So I'm very grateful to be here now with you. This question is specifically about aphantasia. So what resources do the two of you go to when exploring aphantasia, either for yourselves, with clients, with kiddos? Any thoughts in general on how to explore aphantasia more deeply?
I'll go first, and then we'll see if Marni has anything to add. I honestly don't have a ton of resources. Do you happen to remember that website that we were texting about this a couple weeks ago and looking at what the actual terms are, and what I think it was maybe aphantasia.com. It was this website that has all kinds of resources about aphantasia, and that was helpful, and it talked about the actual term for what I experience is hypophantasia as opposed to fully aphantasia. And then there's hyperphantasia, phantasia, which is sort of what the majority of people are, and then hypophantasia, and then aphantasia. And so I'm in that hypo. So I have some images, but they're sort of like paintings where you're only seeing part of the picture and they come in and out, but it's not very, very clear. But other than that, just that website is the only thing I've come across so far, and it's on my list to do some more research on that.
Yeah, I think aphantasia is a really interesting one because it's not pathologized. It's not in the DSM. People are not really aware of it, and yet it actually is a very interesting difference in the way that people experience the world. And when Katie and I were talking about it, I was like, oh no, I'm actually fully aphantasic. I don't see images in my head at all, but I dream in full images.
But I don't.
So very interesting. It is, yeah. And also interestingly, when we talk about this in my family, this is how we first talked about this, was when one of my kids got a neuropsych. And we were talking about the one where you put the numbers in sequence. And for me, I can only do that task by repeating them auditorily, 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, something like that. My partner was like, well, yeah, I just put them up in my head. I can read them backwards. I could read the 3rd, 5th, 2nd, whatever order. And I'm just like, what are you talking about?
And what's so interesting too with that is that the mental imagery that I do have is pretty much black or white, or black and white. And I actually have very clear pictures of words. So I was a spelling bee winner when I was a kid because I would close my eyes and picture the word written. But that's the only thing that I picture is words. And so when people are talking to me, I often am imagining the words and even typing the words with my fingers, but I'm not actually seeing images of things. So it's all, yeah, it's just interesting how different it is. And then one other thing I was gonna say about that too, knowing about this would have been really helpful with childbirth, because I looked into all these different methods of how to get through labor without medication. And the one that had been really recommended was something where you use guided imagery. And I didn't know at the time that I had a different experience than other people. And so I tried so hard. I did all of the work. I listened to these CDs over and over again where I was supposed to, create this happy place, this comfortable place. And then I got into labor and it was useless to me completely. And I had to create something on my own in the moment, which I was able to do. But it was like, if I had known that, I could have used a different resource.
I do want to add, I think on our Overexcitabilities questionnaire survey, we have a question about this. So you can indicate your alignment with the spectrum of aphantasia. Here's Nicole.
I'm debating whether or not I feel like it's safe to ask the question here, but I'm asking about a safety for kids question. And that is, I'm strong in encouraging divergence or all sorts of authenticity, and being from Texas and the LGBTQAI plus issues, it's not safe to discuss. It's not safe for kids to disclose, and trying to create safe spaces. How would you suggest crafting language when talking to parents in that space so that you can normalize individuality and difference, knowing that it might not be safe for them to encourage their children to disclose? I'm grappling, so if you have suggestions.
Do you mean disclose like being queer, or disclose neurodivergence, or both?
More about the queer, but also, but gender, and I don't even want to say sexuality, because a lot of times the kids, it's not even about it's not about a sexuality, it's just about not identifying with what they see in the world, like, oh, this is feminine, this is masculine, or, whatever. And in a space where identities are very prescribed, and in fact, legally prescribed based on a birth certificate or something like that. What suggestions do you have on coaching for that language with parents, with school spaces?
No, thank you for the question. It's so important. And I have to say that it's really hard for me to answer that because I live an hour from San Francisco, where it's so accepted there. Like, it's baffling to me to go other places where it's not. So I honestly don't know, because I've never had to navigate that.
And I also live near Boulder, and so also pretty accepted here. But I guess what comes to mind is just creating safe spaces where you can, so your home, your classroom, knowing that you are a safe person is always the place to start for the family, for the children. And then beyond that, when there's those big cultural factors at play, you just do what you can and encourage people to stay safe, right? Yeah.
Oh, we have a couple back here, and then we'll come up there.
Thank you. My question is a great follow-on to your question. I rediscovered my giftedness just about a year ago. Diagnosed, sorry, I tend to use in second grade, and living with being, I realize now, very different for many decades, and now understanding those differences much better. But I'm looking for suggestions on how to talk with other people about me and people I've known for some time, new people. I can see now where I'm different than a lot of other people, and yet I actually kind of don't bring it up because I don't want to say, well, I'm gifted and I'm different. I mean, I tried that, it doesn't go well.
Well, we have empowered you to use the word neurodivergent instead, if you like. So you could say I'm neurodivergent, even if giftedness is the only identifier that you currently identify with or ever identify with that is a form of neurodivergence. And people may or may not understand what that means, but at least they won't have the knee-jerk reaction like you're a jerk.
I did try that, and the response that I got was one of the titles of your books. Well, everybody's neurodivergent. I mean, and we are all special, aren't we? I mean,
but that's when you say, no, we're all neurodiverse, but we're not all neurodivergent. And Katy and I didn't cover that in this one, but neurodiversity applies to every human. We are all different, right? But neurodivergent is specifically people whose experience diverges substantially from what is expected.
And I think on our, oh no, we didn't include it on there, huh? Oh, right, because that was, okay, yeah, resources is what I'm looking for. Did we include it on there?
The second one.
Second one on the list, We're All Neurodiverse by Sunny Jane Wise is a really wonderful book. And Sunny doesn't mention giftedness specifically in the book, but they do recognize giftedness as neurodivergence. So just something to know. But that book can be really helpful in just navigating that experience. And I think they do a really great job of using language that I think you can use in your everyday life.
We are a little over time, but we have a few more questions. Can we keep going for a second? Okay. Here's one from a biology student who has wandered into the room and stayed for a moment and has a question.
Hi, so I study secondary ed with bio. So one of the questions that always comes into my mind is how can educators or universities and colleges help build in academic equity while dealing with neurodivergent students, or especially in regards to academic policies. For example, most students, until they get academic probation or suspension, they don't see the need to actually kind of get accommodations or find out if there is something that they need, like extra help or something. So but usually what I see, the common trend among universities is they don't have when they consider academic development or policies, they don't consider equity, because what about international students that come in hundreds and thousands of them into the US every year? Schools, a lot of schools don't have facilities where they can help students recognize what are their gifts or what are their weaknesses. So how do you think in or off the classroom, educators or people who have the power to take these decisions can help students build equity within these academic policies? Sorry, that was a long question.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I will just say that I touched briefly on it, that Katy and I both practice self-directed education with our children. And so we really believe in some pretty significant shifts in education broadly around making it more learner-centered instead of so top-down driven and so based around standards and standardizing everything and everyone being at the same level. But you raised some really great questions, especially and one of the things that came to mind was the piece around students not wanting to take accommodations. And I'm hoping that that will change as the neurodiversity paradigm continues to educate, and as we are able to educate our young people about what it means to have a different wiring, that the accommodations are not something that is meant to put them above their peers, but rather is just to help them access the material. What do you think?
Yeah, everything Marni said. And then as you were talking, I was thinking of like what would have helped me when I was in college. And I was remembering how there were various workshops and things that were held, like in like the dorms, like in the residence halls. There were things about like sexuality and various other things that were like educational. This was a long time ago though, I have to say. But if there were things about neurodiversity, that would be great. And I don't know if that's happening right now, but that would be helpful. And then the other thing I was going to say is just in terms of some kinds of neurodivergence, to have a really robust disabled student services department, like where I live. One of the universities there, it's just a junior college, but it's known for having a really wonderful disabled student services. And so I've had a lot of clients that have gotten amazing accommodations, but it takes them actually knowing that they need the accommodations. And so having the education piece, it'd be great if they had them on the university campuses, but really it needs to happen sooner, really. Like it's a bigger issue than just universities needing to take it on. Like it needs to happen much sooner, high school, younger, for people to understand that all these different experiences exist, and does this fit for you?
And bridging on that, I actually just went through the community college disability services with my oldest child, and they were fabulous. They were absolutely wonderful. And I've heard that that is the case at many community colleges especially, but we need to go younger in terms of getting rid of the shame around neurodivergence, because that's really where it's coming from, is that in K-12 education, these are often seen as really, things that you don't want. And that is where a lot of that comes from, like not wanting to be identified in that way. But I think that the more that we can have people sharing their experiences, because in college, what I actually would have needed was someone to say like, you can have found everything easy all the way up to this point, and you can still have challenges that you don't understand. You may be pulling all-nighters, not just because you can, but because that's how your brain will then pay attention, right? Like an ADHD sort of accommodation for yourself that you figured out this workaround. But actually, it would be a lot less stressful for you if we chunked it out and worked it back a little bit.